The dust rose in swirling clouds, twisting like it was alive. It was taunting her, taunting the broken girl standing on that rough wooden platform. The crowd roared with laughter, their eyes glinting with a special kind of cruelty you only find in forgotten towns at the edge of the world. Her name was Ara. Her head was bowed, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were bone white. Dust clung to her tear-streaked cheeks, a mask of pure shame. This wasn't a trial. It was worse. The way the men looked at her, the way they jeered and whispered, it felt like being buried alive. Her crime was simple. She was an orphan who owed too much money, and in their eyes she was too heavy, too plain for their narrow standards. So Jedediah Thorne, a man made of grease and greed, had bought her debt for pennies on the dollar, and now he was putting on a show. Thorne was a giant of a man, round and slick, with a voice that dripped with poison. He spread his arms wide like he was presenting a prize hog at the county fair. "Gentlemen," he rasped, his words sharp and oily, "a rare offering today, not what some of you are used to, perhaps, but ample all the same." The men bellowed with laughter. Every chuckle was another nail in the coffin of her dignity. She just stared at the dirt, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Shame was a noose, and it was tightening. Then a voice cut through the noise. It was low, calm, and heavy as a gravestone. "How much?" The laughter died instantly. The dust itself seemed to hang motionless in the air. Every single head in that crowd turned. And there, at the edge of the mob, stood Silas Blackwood. Silas Blackwood was a man carved from the land itself. He was hard and weathered like the granite cliffs that towered over his ranch. His face was a road map of sun and sorrow, and his eyes were the color of a cold winter sky. He was a ghost in this town, a man who rarely spoke, who rarely came to town at all. And when he did, no one dared cross him. His silence was a warning. For a moment, even Jedediah Thorne faltered. He was surprised Blackwood had spoken at all. Then a greasy smirk spread across his face. "Well now, didn't think you were the marrying kind, Blackwood," Thorne sneered. "Or maybe you just want some extra warmth when those winter winds start to blow." The crowd laughed again, but this time it was an uneasy sound, because you just didn't mock Silas Blackwood to his face. Silas's gaze didn't shift from Era. He didn't see the shame Thorne was trying to plaster all over her. He saw the trembling in her shoulders. He saw the tears shining, unshed, in her lashes. He saw the raw pain that tightened her mouth. He saw a person drowning, and he was the only one in the whole damn town who seemed to notice. "Name your price, Thorne," Silas said again. His voice was flat, cold, final. Thorne stroked his chin, pretending to think it over. "For you, Blackwood, let's say $50. He spat the number out. "A bargain, really, for so much, woman." The sneer in his voice was a physical slap, but Silas didn't even blink. He reached into his leather pouch. The coins clinked, a sharp, clean sound in the sudden silence. He dropped them, one by one, into Thorne's greedy, waiting palm. He didn't count them. He didn't hesitate. "She's free of you," Silas said. The words were not a question. They were not a request. They were law. He turned to Ara, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "You'll come with me." It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea. It was a lifeline. Her throat tightened, her breath catching in her chest. She dared to lift her eyes to meet his gaze, and in his eyes there was no pity, no mockery. There was just a steady, quiet respect she had forgotten could even exist in this world. She nodded, a small, broken movement. It was all she could manage, but it was enough. The ride to Blackwood's ranch was long and silent. The land grew harsher as they rode, stretching out wide and empty, a perfect mirror for how she felt inside. When they finally arrived, all she saw was solitude. A small cabin, a barn, a corral, no flowers, no warmth, just function and survival. This was a place a man came to disappear. Silas helped her down from the mare, his hand rough but surprisingly careful. "Cabin's there," he grunted, pointing. "Food in the pantry. Bed's made." He didn't look at her. He just busied himself with the horses, as if the whole world depended on him unsaddling them right that second. Her voice trembled when she finally worked up the courage to ask, "Mr. Blackwood, why?" The question just hung there in the air between them. For a long, long time he was silent. His back was to her, a solid wall against the fading light. The wind sighed through the eaves of the barn. Finally he turned, his face mostly in shadow. "No one deserves to be paraded," he said. His voice was rough like gravel underfoot, as if the words themselves hurt him to speak. He held her gaze for just a heartbeat, then looked away. "You're safe here. Rest." And then he led the horses away, leaving her standing alone in the dust. Safe. The word felt foreign on her tongue. Inside the cabin, it was neat but bare. One bed, a small table, a cold fireplace. This was the home of a man who lived only for necessity, not for comfort. That night, she lay awake, listening to the coyotes cry, listening to her own heart race. She thought of Thorne's sneer, the crowd's laughter, the shame, and then she thought of Silas's eyes, steady, unmoved by cruelty. For the first time in years, she clung to that steadiness, like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. But a question burned inside her as the night stretched on. What did he want from her? What price would she eventually have to pay for this kindness? Because in her world, nothing was ever free. The morning light spilled across the plains, pale and gold. Era sat at the cabin table, her hands twisted together in her lap. She expected him to lay down the rules, to tell her what chores she'd be doing to earn her keep, to reveal his true price. But when Silas came in from the barn, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands already rough from work, he just nodded. He took his place at the table, and they ate in silence. Bread, beans, and water. No words, no questions, no expectations. He didn't watch her eat. He didn't measure her worth. He didn't remind her of the debt he now owned. He just let her be. And in that silence, something inside her that had been broken for a very long time began to mend. Days turned into weeks. Silas rose before dawn and worked the land until sundown. He was a machine, fueled by a grief she couldn't yet understand. He asked nothing of her. He spoke very little. And he never, ever crossed the invisible line that held her fragile dignity intact. His silence was strange, but it was also a gift. It gave her room to breathe, room to gather the shattered pieces of herself. So she began to fill that space. She swept the cabin until the floorboards shone. She mended his worn-out shirts, her stitches small and neat. She found an old hoe by the barn and attacked a patch of hard, unforgiving ground, clearing it for a garden. The work gave her a purpose. It made her feel less like a charity case and more like a partner. She needed to give something back. One evening, she found a small pouch left on the table. Inside were seeds, beans, squash, corn. There was no note. No words were spoken. It was just a silent gift, a silent acknowledgement. Her heart swelled with something she couldn't name. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was respect. A quiet understanding that her work, her effort, mattered. She was beginning to see the man behind the silence. She noticed the way he handled his animals, with a surprising gentleness in his calloused hands. She saw the profound sadness that sometimes settled in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. And she saw the silver locket. He wore it tucked under his shirt, but sometimes when he was tired, he would pull it out and just hold it, his thumb rubbing over the smooth metal. It was a secret he carried close to his heart. Her curiosity finally got the better of her. One afternoon, while he was out mending a fence on the far side of the property, she was cleaning the cabin. High on a shelf, tucked away in the back, she found a small wooden box. Her hands trembled as she took it down. Inside, her breath caught in her throat. There was a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. And underneath it, a child's drawing. A crude picture of a stick-figure family, a man, a woman, and a small girl, standing under a crooked sun. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Silas had known loss. A wife, a child. His silence wasn't born of pride or coldness. It was born of a grief so deep it had been carved into the very marrow of his bones. She closed the box carefully, her own chest aching with a shared sorrow. He wasn't just a rescuer. He was a man who was just as broken as she was, and that's when she realized something else. He hadn't just saved her from humiliation, he was trying to save himself too. But their fragile peace was about to be shattered. News travels fast in a town like Redemption Gulch. The whispers about Silas Blackwood and the orphan girl he'd bought for $50 spread like wildfire. Thorne especially was seething. His public spectacle had been ruined. His authority had been undermined. He started making trouble. He shorted Silas on supplies at the general store. He spread vicious rumors that Blackwood had finally gone crazy, taking in damaged goods. The townsfolk, already wary of Silas, kept their distance even more. When Ara walked beside him into town, their eyes would slide away, their whispers following them like buzzing flies. But she was starting to care less. She had food. She had a roof over her head. And for the first time in her life, she had someone who didn't treat her like she was less than human. Then came the day Thorne rode out to the ranch. The sun was high and hot, beating down on the dry earth. Silas was mending a corral fence, his back a rigid line of muscle. Era was kneeling in her garden, which was now a small patch of defiant green in the vast brown landscape. Her hands were buried in the dark, cool soil. The sound of hoofbeats broke the stillness. 3 riders. Jedediah Thorne sat tall in his saddle, flanked by 2 of his grim-faced lackeys. His piggish eyes swept over the ranch, over her garden, and finally over her. It was the look of a predator sizing up its prey. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Just checking on my investment. Making sure you're taking good care of her, Blackwood." His grin was a grotesque slash in his puffy face. "Wouldn't want her to spoil." Era froze, the old familiar dread washing over her in an icy wave. Silas stood up straight, the hammer still clutched in his hand. His face was stone, but his eyes burned with a deadly warning. "She's not your investment, Thorne," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "This is my land. You're not welcome here." Thorne just chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Feisty, aren't you, Blackwood? That $50 was generous, I'll admit. But maybe not generous enough for all the trouble you've caused me." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Maybe I ought to repossess my property. Or maybe she can work off her true value right here and now." One of his men snickered. Ara's stomach turned to ice. Silas took one step forward, his knuckles white around the handle of the hammer. His voice was quiet, but it was the most terrifying sound Ara had ever heard. "You'll leave now, and you won't come back." Thorne's face darkened, a cruel gleam flashing in his eyes. "You threatening me, dirt farmer? You and what army?" His boot shifted in the stirrup, as if he was about to dismount. Ara's breath caught in her throat. She felt paralyzed. And then something inside Silas Blackwood broke. The quiet, grieving man disappeared. And something else, something primal and full of rage, took his place. "I said," he roared, the sound torn from the deepest parts of his soul, "get off my land!" The air turned electric. The storm had just arrived. The air snapped tight, thick with a tension you could almost taste. Thorne swung down from his saddle, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy, arrogant thud. His pistol glinted at his side, his sneer wide and full of menace. He thought he had this won. He thought Silas was just a broken old farmer. He was wrong. Silas moved faster than a striking snake. He closed the distance in a single heartbeat, the hammer in his hand now a blur of motion. Thorne barely had time to grunt in surprise before Silas grabbed him by the shirt front, lifted him clean off the ground, and slammed him down into the dust. The impact was ugly, a wheezing gasp escaping Thorne's lips as he clawed at the dirt, stunned. The first lackey lunged forward, swinging a heavy wooden club. Silas spun, the hammer clashing against the wood with a sharp, sickening crack. With one powerful, fluid motion, he brought the hammer around in a brutal arc, shattering the man's shoulder. The man howled in agony, stumbling backward, his arm hanging uselessly at his side. The second thug froze. He was torn between fight and flight, but the sight of his boss struggling on the ground and his partner screaming in pain made the decision for him. Fear won. Ara's heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gripped the hoe from her garden, her knuckles white, her whole body shaking. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. But she couldn't. Not this time. Not when the one man who had shown her a shred of dignity was standing alone against them. Thorn, sputtering in the dust, finally clawed for his pistol. Rage twisted his swollen face into an ugly mask. "You'll regret this, Blackwood," he spat, his fat fingers curling around the grip of the gun. "Silas!" Era screamed, lunging forward without thinking. But Silas was quicker. He kicked out, his boots slamming into Thorn's side, knocking the wind from the man's lungs. The pistol fired, the shot going wild, burying itself in the wall of the barn. And then Silas was on him. His fists fell like iron hammers. Each blow was fueled by years of pent-up grief, of silent suffering. Each strike was a vow that he would never let this kind of cruelty triumph again. Not on his land, not on his watch. The second lackey, the one who had frozen, finally broke. He turned and scrambled back onto his horse, kicking it into a frantic gallop. He disappeared down the trail in a cloud of panicked dust. The first one was still on the ground, groaning, clutching his broken arm. Thorn was no longer fighting back. He just lay there, a bloodied, wheezing mess, his face swelling and purpling beneath Silas's relentless assault. Finally, Silas stopped. He stood over Thorn, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The hammer was still in his hand, but it was lowered now. The blazing fury in his eyes was dimming, replaced by something heavier, something weary. He had defended his land, but he had done more than that. He had defended her. Just then, the sound of another horse approached, this one at a steady, unhurried pace. Sheriff Brody reined in, his eyes narrowing as he took in the chaotic scene. He saw the pistol lying in the dirt. He saw Thorn, beaten and barely conscious. He saw Silas, standing firm, bruised but unbroken. And he saw Era, pale but resolute, the garden hoe still clutched tight in her hands. "Silas," the sheriff said grimly, swinging down from his horse. "What in tarnation happened here?" "He came onto my land," Silas answered, his voice steady, though rough with exhaustion. "He threatened us." He jerked his chin toward Thorn's crumpled form. "He won't be doing it again." Thorn, seeing his chance, immediately began to wail, his swollen lips spitting out a torrent of lies. "He attacked me, Sheriff. Unprovoked. The man's a lunatic. He tried to kill me." Sheriff Brody's gaze moved from Thorn's battered body to Silas's solemn, stony face. Then his eyes landed on Era. He looked at her wide, honest eyes. He saw the terror there, but also the truth. Her expression told the real story better than any words could. Brody let out a long, slow sigh, his jaw tightening. He had known Silas Blackwood for years. He knew the tragedy that had hollowed him out. He also knew Jedediah Thorn and the kind of slimy, bullying power he thrived on. He made his decision. "Get up, Thorn," the sheriff said, his voice cold as a winter morning. He grabbed the larger man by the collar and hauled him to his feet. "You're coming with me. Disturbing the peace. Assault. We'll sort this out in town." Thorn sputtered and cursed, but he knew he'd lost. The law was the law, at least for today. Brody tied Thorn to his saddle like a sack of rancid grain, and then helped the injured lackey onto his own horse. As he rode away, the dust trailing behind him was like a curtain closing on a violent play. The ranch was suddenly, profoundly quiet. Silas let the hammer drop. It hit the earth with a dull, final thud. His knees nearly buckled, but he caught himself, his chest still heaving, his eyes dark with a bone-deep exhaustion. Era rushed forward, the hoe forgotten now, dropping into the dirt of her garden. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you hurt?" He looked down at her, his face bruised, a trickle of blood running from a cut on his lip. But in his gaze there was no fear, no leftover anger. There was only a quiet, weary peace. "Just tired," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Just tired." Her hand reached out and touched his arm. It was a light touch, but it was filled with more meaning than 1,000 words. In that moment, she saw all of him, not just the man who had saved her, but the man who had bared his grief, his scars, his very soul, to defend her dignity. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would have done the same for him. That night, as she gently cleaned the cuts on his hands and face, the silence between them was different. It was no longer heavy with unspoken fears or the ghosts of the past. It was filled with something new, something unsteady and fragile, but beautiful. It was the silence of two broken souls beginning to heal together. It was the silence of hope. But what neither of them knew was that Thorne wasn't just a bully. He was a pawn in a much larger, much more dangerous game. And Sheriff Brody hadn't taken him to jail out of a sense of justice. He had taken him away to protect him. The real storm wasn't over. It was just getting started. The ranch began to change. Era's garden thrived, a vibrant splash of green and yellow against the monotonous dust. Her laughter, soft and rare at first, started to echo inside the small cabin, chasing away the shadows that had lingered in the corners for far too long. It was a sound Silas hadn't realized how much he'd missed. Silas still wore the silver locket, a constant, quiet tribute to the family he had lost. But now when he touched it, it wasn't just with sorrow. There was a new warmth there, a sense of peace, as if his lost wife and child could finally rest easier, knowing he wasn't alone anymore. They found a new rhythm, a life built on silent understanding and shared work. They didn't talk about the future. They didn't talk about the past. They just lived, day by day, finding a fragile kind of happiness in the simple routines of survival. But the town of Redemption Gulch hadn't forgotten. Thorne was out of jail in less than a day, nursing a grudge as ugly as his bruised face. He was quiet, though. Too quiet. That was what worried Sheriff Brody. Brody wasn't a good man, not really. He was a man who valued order above all else. And Thorne, for all his bluster, was a predictable kind of trouble. Silas Blackwood, on the other hand, the sheriff had seen something in his eyes during that fight. A line had been crossed. The sleeping giant had been woken, and Brody had a sinking feeling that this was far from over. One evening, as the prairie wind swept soft and warm across the land, Era was looking out the cabin window. She saw Silas standing by the corral, his silhouette dark against the blood-red sunset. He was just standing there, staring out at the endless plains. "You saved me, Silas," she said, her voice gentle, coming up behind him. He shook his head slowly, not turning to look at her. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "We saved each other." And in that simple truth, a world of possibility opened up before them. The lonely rancher had found redemption. The outcast orphan had found her worth. In the harshest corner of the West, two broken souls had carved out a life. Not of pity, not of shame, but of quiet strength, respect, and something that was beginning to feel a lot like love. The dust of Redemption Gulch still swirled in the distance, a constant reminder of the cruelty of the world. But here, on this stubborn patch of land, hope had taken root. And they thought for a fleeting moment that they were finally safe. That was their first mistake. Because miles away, in a plush, velvet-lined train car, a man was reading a telegram. He was a man who owned railroads, who owned politicians, who owned towns like Redemption Gulch. And Jedediah Thorne was one of his employees. The telegram was simple. It just said, "Blackwood is a problem. The asset is with him." The man in the train car smiled, a cold, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. He picked up a pen and wrote a reply. "Liquidate the problem. Recover the asset. No witnesses." The storm wasn't coming for Silas and Ara. It was already there, and it had a name. The first sign that something was wrong was the well. Silas went out one morning, just after dawn, and found the water tainted. It was murky, with an oily sheen on the surface and a bitter, chemical taste. It wasn't an accident. The rope for the bucket had been deliberately frayed, almost cut all the way through. It was a warning, a slow, creeping threat designed to unsettle them. They had a few barrels of fresh water stored, enough for a few days, but after that, they'd be in trouble. "We can ride to the creek," Era suggested, her voice tight with worry. Silas just shook his head, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The creek is 5 miles out, in the open. That's what they want." They. He didn't have to say who. They both knew. The next day it was the fence on the north pasture. The wires had been cut, all 3 strands, clean through. His small herd of cattle, his only real source of income, had scattered across the plains. It took them the entire day, riding under the blazing sun, to round them all up. By the time they got back to the ranch, exhausted and dehydrated, they found a new message. A dead crow was nailed to their cabin door. It was a symbol, a promise of death. Thorn was playing with them. He wasn't just trying to drive them out. He was enjoying it. He was trying to break their spirit before he broke their bodies. Fear began to seep into their quiet life, a poison more potent than the one in the well. Era found herself jumping at every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the sigh of the wind. Silas grew even quieter, his face a grim mask of concentration. He started sleeping with his old rifle by his bed. He was a rancher, not a gunslinger, but he knew how to defend his home. They were isolated, alone. The nearest friendly face was miles away, and even then, no one in Redemption Gulch would dare to stand against Thorn and the power he represented. They were on their own. One night, Era woke up with a gasp. She'd had a nightmare. She was back on that platform, the crowd laughing, Thorn's greasy face looming over her. But this time, when she looked for Silas at the edge of the crowd, he wasn't there. She was alone. She sat up in her cot, her heart hammering. The cabin was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight coming through the window. She saw that Silas wasn't in his bed. Panic seized her. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and crept to the door. She peered outside, and she saw him. He was standing near the barn, a shovel in his hands, digging. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he was digging a grave. Her breath caught in her throat. She almost cried out his name. But then she saw what he was doing. He wasn't digging a grave. He was undigging one. He was carefully removing the dirt from a long-forgotten spot just behind the barn, a place overgrown with weeds. He finally hit something wooden. With a grunt of effort, he pried open a hidden cellar door she had never known existed. He disappeared down into the darkness. He emerged a few minutes later, carrying a heavy, dust-covered wooden chest. He brought it into the cabin and set it on the table. He looked at Ara, his face grim in the pale light. There were no more secrets between them. It was too late for that. "I hoped I'd never have to open this again," he said, his voice rough. He unlatched the lid. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, was not a rifle. It was a pair of matching Colt Peacemakers, their silver finish gleaming in the moonlight. The handles were worn smooth from use. Beside them was a gun belt, the leather cracked with age but still strong, and underneath it all was a small, leather-bound journal, the journal of his late wife, Sarah. "Thorn didn't just cause their deaths, Era," Silas said, his voice cracking for the first time. "He was there. He was the one who—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He pushed the journal across the table towards her. "The truth is in there. All of it. Why he wants this land. Why he'll never stop until he gets it." And as Ara opened the first page, she realized the dead crow on the door wasn't just a threat. It was a calling card. Ara's hands trembled as she read the elegant, looping script of Sarah Blackwood. The journal started with hope. It spoke of building a life with Silas, of their dreams for the ranch, of the birth of their daughter, Lily. It was a life filled with love and simple joys. But then, the tone began to change. A new name appeared in the entries, Mr. Corbin, a wealthy man from back east, representing the Transcontinental Railroad. He wanted to buy their land, claiming it was essential for a new spur line. Silas refused. This land was his family's legacy. It wasn't for sale. Corbin smiled and said he understood, but the threats started soon after. At first, it was small things, just like what was happening to them now. Tainted water, cut fences. Then it escalated. Jedediah Thorne, who at the time was just a local tough hired by Corbin, started paying visits. He was cruder, more direct. Sarah wrote of her fear, of the way Thorne looked at her, at Lily. She wrote about a secret she'd uncovered. The railroad spur line was a lie. Corbin didn't want the land for tracks. He wanted it for what was underneath it. Water. Sarah had discovered that the Blackwood Ranch sat on top of the largest underground aquifer in the entire territory. In this dry, unforgiving land, water was more precious than gold. Corbin's plan was to buy up all the surrounding ranches for pennies, then sell the water rights back to them and to the railroad for a fortune. He would control the entire region. Silas's ranch was the key. He had the primary access point to the aquifer, right where the old well was. That's why they hadn't just killed him. They needed him to sign the deed. The last entry in the journal was hurried, frantic. Sarah wrote that she had found Corbin's original survey maps and his signed contracts with Thorne. They were hidden in a lockbox under the floorboards of the barn. It was the proof they needed to expose the entire scheme. The entry ended abruptly. Thorne is here. Silas is in town for supplies. He's at the door. Oh God, he has Lily. The rest of the page was blank. Era closed the journal, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Now she understood. Silas's silence, his grief. It wasn't just from loss. It was from guilt. He had been away when his family needed him most. He had spent years blaming himself, hiding from the world, trying to bury the past. But the past refused to stay buried. He killed them, Silas said, his voice a hollow whisper in the dark cabin. He set fire to the house to cover his tracks. The sheriff at the time, a man on Corbin's payroll, ruled it an accident, a fallen lantern. Case closed. He looked at the twin revolvers on the table. These were my father's. I was never a gunslinger, but Thorne, Corbin, they turned me into something else. He hadn't just been a grieving rancher all these years. He had been a man waiting for the day when the past would come back to collect its due. And now it was here. He's not just after the land anymore, is he? Era asked softly. Silas shook his head. He knows about the journal. He doesn't know what's in it, but Sarah told him she was documenting everything. And he knows I have the lockbox with the proof. He thinks it's still hidden here somewhere. So Thorne's attacks weren't just to scare them. They were to flush them out, to make them run, so he and his men could tear the ranch apart looking for that box. Suddenly, a new horrifying thought struck Era. Her own history. Her parents, dead from a sudden fever when she was a child. Their small farm foreclosed on, bought for almost nothing by an anonymous investor from the East. Her debt, which had landed her on that auction block, had originated from that foreclosure. Corbin, she whispered, her blood running cold. He bought my parents' land too. It wasn't a coincidence. None of it was. Thorne hadn't just picked her at random. He had specifically bought her debt. He knew who she was. He was using her as bait, a way to torture Silas, to dangle another innocent life in front of him, to twist the knife of his past failure. She wasn't just a victim. She was a pawn, but the game was about to change, because the pawns were about to start fighting back. We have to get that box, Era said, her voice firm, a new resolve hardening her features. We have to get it to the U.S. Marshals in Prescott. Silas looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his weary eyes. He saw that the frightened girl he'd rescued from the platform was gone. In her place was a woman made of steel. It's hidden in the old cellar, he said, under the floorboards, just like she wrote. I never moved it. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Then we get it now, she said, and we ride. They moved with a silent, shared purpose. Ara grabbed a sack and filled it with what little food they had, some dried jerky, a few biscuits, a water skin she filled from their dwindling supply. Silas strapped on the old gun belt. The Colts settled on his hips as if they were made for him. He was no longer just a rancher. He was the justice this valley had been denied for years. They slipped out of the cabin and crept toward the barn, moving through the shadows like ghosts. The moon was high, casting a stark, silver light over the ranch. Every rustle of the wind sounded like approaching footsteps. Silas pried open the hidden cellar door again. The air that rose up was cool and smelled of damp earth and forgotten memories. He lit a small lantern, and they descended the rickety wooden steps into the darkness. The cellar was small, just a dirt-walled room. Silas went to the far corner and began prying at the floorboards with a crowbar he'd grabbed from the barn. The wood groaned in protest, and that's when they heard it. A low whistle from outside, a signal, followed by the soft nicker of a horse. They weren't alone. Thorne's men were already here, surrounding the property, watching them. The attack on the well, the fence, the crow. It was all a distraction, a way to wear them down, to make them careless. Thorne had been playing chess while they were just trying to survive. The floorboard came loose with a sudden crack. Underneath, just as Sarah had written, was a small iron lockbox. Silas lifted it out. It was heavy, heavy with the truth. "We're trapped," Ara whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Silas looked at the box, then at the ladder leading up to the moonlit barn. He looked at Ara. "They want the box," he said, his voice low and steady. "They think it's their victory, but we're going to make it their tomb." He checked the loads in his peacemakers. The metallic click echoed in the small, silent space. "They've forgotten what this land is," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "They see it as dirt to be bought and sold. But it's my home. It remembers." He was right. The ranch wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a fortress, and he knew every inch of it. The battle for Blackwood Ranch was about to begin. "There's a tunnel," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of their own frantic breathing. "My grandfather dug it during the Apache raids. It connects this cellar to the old well." He pointed to the back wall of the cellar. It looked like solid earth, but as he pushed against a section of it, a cleverly hidden door made of wood and packed dirt swung inward, revealing a narrow, dark passage. "It's a tight squeeze, but it'll get us outside the barn without them seeing. From there we can make it to the rocks on the ridge. We'll have the high ground." It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. Era clutched the heavy lockbox to her chest. It was their only hope. If they lost it, the deaths of Silas's family, of her parents, would all be for nothing. "I'll go first," Silas said, handing her one of the Colt peacemakers. "You know how to use one of these?" Era shook her head, her eyes wide. "Point and pull the trigger," he said grimly. "Don't hesitate. They won't." He slipped into the tunnel, the lantern casting flickering shadows on the narrow dirt walls. Era followed close behind, the cold, heavy iron of the lockbox pressing against her ribs. The tunnel was claustrophobic, smelling of earth and decay. It felt like they were being buried alive. After what felt like an eternity, they saw a faint circle of light ahead. The stars. They had reached the old dry well. Silas cautiously poked his head up. The well was about 50 yards from the barn, shielded by a cluster of overgrown bushes. He could see them now, at least half a dozen men moving silently, closing in on the barn where they thought Silas and Era were trapped. Thorne was with them, directing them with hand signals, his face eager and cruel in the moonlight. "Go," Silas whispered, giving Ara a gentle push. "Head for the ridge. Stay low. Don't stop for anything. I'll hold them off." "No," Era said, her voice fierce. "I'm not leaving you." "You have to," he insisted. "The box is everything. Get it to Prescott. Tell them what happened here. Tell them everything." For a moment, their eyes locked in the darkness. It was a silent, desperate goodbye. Then she was gone, scrambling out of the well and disappearing into the tall grass, a shadow moving toward the dark shape of the ridge. Silas watched her go, a prayer on his lips. Then he turned his attention back to the barn. He took a deep breath, raised his revolver, and fired a single shot at the lantern they had left burning in the cellar. The barn was plunged into darkness. The men outside froze. "He knows we're here," Thorne hissed. "Spread out. Flush him out. I want him alive, you hear me?" Silas smiled grimly in the dark. That was Thorne's second mistake of the night. He wanted him alive. Silas had no such limitations. He was no longer Silas Blackwood, the quiet rancher. He was a ghost, a phantom haunting his own land, and he was about to deliver his judgment. The men advanced on the barn, their guns drawn. They were confident, a pack of wolves closing in on a cornered sheep. They kicked open the main door and stormed in. The barn was empty, silent. "Check the loft," one of them shouted, his voice echoing in the vast empty space. A lanky gunman started climbing the ladder to the hayloft. He was halfway up when a shot rang out from the darkness outside. The gunman grunted, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and then tumbled backward off the ladder, landing in a lifeless heap on the barn floor. Panic erupted. "Where did that come from?" "I can't see him!" They started firing blindly into the darkness, their muzzle flashes illuminating their terrified faces. Silas was already moving. He was using the corrals, the watering troughs, the shadows themselves as cover. He was a part of this land. They were just trespassers. And the land was on his side. He picked them off one by one. A shot from behind the woodpile took down a man trying to circle around the back. Another from the roof of the small chicken coop silenced a thug who was using a wagon for cover. Each shot was deliberate, precise, deadly. The confidence of Thorne's men evaporated, replaced by a primal fear. They weren't fighting a man. They were fighting a ghost who knew every inch of their hunting ground. Thorne was screaming orders, his voice high and panicked. But his men were no longer listening. They were huddled together in the barn, too afraid to move, firing at shadows. Silas had them pinned. He had bought Ara the time she needed. He just hoped it was enough. Ara ran, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The lockbox was a lead weight in her arms, but she didn't dare slow down. The sound of gunfire behind her spurred her on. Each shot a painful punctuation mark in the terrifying night. She reached the base of the ridge and began to climb, her fingers clawing at the loose rock and scrub brush. She finally pulled herself over the top, collapsing behind a large boulder, gasping for air. She peered back down at the ranch. She could see the muzzle flashes from the barn, a chaotic spray of panicked shots. And she could see the single, deliberate flashes from the darkness, each one finding its mark. Silas was a phantom, a righteous fury unleashed. But he was outnumbered. He couldn't keep this up forever. As her breathing steadied, she noticed something else. A flicker of light, far down the main trail leading away from Redemption Gulch. It was a lantern swinging from a fast-moving wagon. It was headed away from the ranch. Her blood ran cold. It was Sheriff Brody. He wasn't coming to help. He was running. He knew what Thorne was doing, what Corbin had ordered, and he was getting out of town before the bodies started piling up. He was a coward, a corrupt, gutless coward. There would be no help from the law. They were completely and utterly alone. A new sound reached her ears, carried on the night wind. Hoofbeats, a lot of them, coming from the direction of the town. Was it more of Thorne's men? Had he called for reinforcements? She squinted into the darkness, her heart sinking. If more men arrived, Silas would be overwhelmed in minutes. But as the riders got closer, she saw they weren't riding like hired guns. And then she saw the figure at their head. It was the town blacksmith, a burly man named Gus. And beside him was the store owner, Mr. Abernathy, and the stable master, and half a dozen other ranchers from the surrounding valley. They were carrying rifles and shotguns. Their faces were grim, determined. They had heard the gunfire, and they had finally decided that enough was enough. Thorne and Corbin had pushed them, bullied them, and squeezed them for years. Tonight, they were pushing back. A fragile spark of hope ignited in Ara's chest. Maybe they weren't so alone after all. The arrival of the townsfolk changed the equation completely. They weren't gunmen, but they were hardened ranchers who knew how to handle a rifle, and they knew this land. They took positions along the ridge, creating a semicircle of fire that rained down on Thorne's terrified, pinned-down men. "Thorne!" Gus the blacksmith roared, his voice booming across the valley. "It's over! Give it up!" Trapped between Silas's ghost-like attacks from the ranch and the new barrage from the ridge, the remaining hired guns lost their nerve. They threw down their weapons and came out of the barn with their hands in the air. All except one, Jedediah Thorne. In the chaos, Thorne had slipped out the back of the barn. He wasn't a fighter. He was a bully and a coward. He scrambled onto his horse and spurred it into a frantic gallop, heading not for the town but east, into the dark, empty plains. He was running, trying to get back to the railroad, back to the safety of his master, Corbin. But Silas saw him. He emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of cold fury. He whistled sharply, and his own horse, a powerful black stallion, came galloping from the corral where it had been hiding. Silas swung into the saddle in one fluid motion and took off after him. The hunt was on. Ara watched from the ridge, her heart in her throat. This was it, the final confrontation. The townsfolk rounded up the surrendered gunmen, their faces a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. They had taken back their valley. Ara knew she had a choice. She could stay here, with the safety of the others, or she could follow. She looked down at the heavy lockbox in her hands. This was the proof. This was their future. But Silas was their heart. She handed the box to Gus. "Keep this safe," she said. "If we're not back by dawn, get this to the marshals in Prescott. Tell them everything." Gus nodded, his eyes full of a newfound respect. Ara found a stray horse, one of the gunmen's, and kicked it into a gallop, following the two distant figures, disappearing into the night. The chase was brutal. Thorne rode with the wild panic of a cornered animal. Silas rode with the relentless, unyielding purpose of an avalanche. The plains were dark, treacherous, riddled with arroyos and prairie dog holes. But Silas knew this land like the back of his hand. He had grown up on it. He had buried his family in it. He gained on Thorne, slowly, steadily. The moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the two riders in a ghostly silver light. Thorne glanced back, his face a mask of pure terror, when he saw how close Silas was. In his panic, he made his final mistake. He drew his pistol and fired wildly over his shoulder. The shot missed by a mile, but the sound spooked his already panicked horse. The horse stumbled, its leg catching in a deep rut, and went down with a high-pitched scream of pain. Thorne was thrown clear, tumbling head over heels before landing hard in the dusty sagebrush. Silas reined in his horse a dozen yards away. He dismounted slowly, his twin colts gleaming in his hands. He walked towards the wheezing, pathetic figure of Jedediah Thorne. Thorne scrambled backward, trying to crawl away, his fancy town clothes ripped and covered in dirt. "Stay back, Blackwood!" he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy. "It wasn't me. It was Corbin. He made me do it. I was just following orders." Silas didn't slow down. He just kept walking, his boots making a soft, rhythmic crunch in the dirt, the sound of impending doom. He stopped right in front of Thorne, looming over him. "For Sarah," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of years of pain. He raised one of the peacemakers. "And for Lily." He raised the other. Just then Ara arrived, her horse breathing hard. She slid from the saddle and ran to his side. "Silas, don't!" she cried, grabbing his arm. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the trembling man on the ground. "He has to pay, Ara." "And he will," she said, her voice pleading. "But not like this. Not by making you a killer. We have the proof. We have witnesses. Let the law handle him. Don't let him take anything else from you. Don't let him take your soul." For a long moment, Silas stood there, the barrels of his guns pointed at the man who had destroyed his life. The wind howled across the plains, the only sound in the tense, silent standoff. He was at a crossroads, vengeance or justice, the past or the future. He looked at Thorne's pathetic, sniveling face, and he saw nothing, just an empty, greedy man who had caused so much pain for nothing more than money. Killing him wouldn't bring back Sarah or Lily. It would just create another ghost to haunt this land. Then he looked at Ara. He saw her strength, her courage. He saw the future. Slowly, painfully, he lowered the guns. He had made his choice. He chose life. He chose her. Thorne, seeing his chance, made a sudden, desperate lunge for the pistol he'd dropped when he fell. He never made it. A single shot rang out in the night. But it wasn't from Silas's guns. Thorne's body jerked, a dark stain spreading across his chest, and he collapsed into the dust, his eyes wide with the ultimate surprise. Silas and Ara spun around. Standing in the moonlight, smoke curling from the barrel of his rifle, was Sheriff Brody. He had come back. "He was trying to escape custody," Brody said, his voice flat and emotionless, as if he were reciting from a book. He walked over and nudged Thorne's body with his boot. "Case closed." Silas and Ara just stared at him, stunned. "Why?" Silas finally asked. Brody sighed, the sound heavy with the weariness of a man who had made too many compromises. "Because I got a wife and 2 kids," he said, not looking at them. "And I want to be able to look them in the eye tomorrow morning. This town, Corbin, it's been a cancer for a long time. You just gave us the courage to cut it out." He had made his choice too. He had chosen his conscience over Corbin's payroll. It was too little, too late for many. But for tonight, it was enough. The aftermath was swift. With the lockbox as undeniable proof and the testimony of Thorne's captured men, the entire conspiracy unraveled. The U.S. Marshals descended on Redemption Gulch. Mr. Corbin was arrested in his fancy train car just before he could flee the territory. His railroad empire, built on lies and blood, came crashing down. The land he had stolen, including the farm that had once belonged to Ara's parents, was returned to its rightful owners or held in trust for the families of his victims. The valley was free. Life on the Blackwood Ranch found a new, quieter rhythm. The townsfolk, no longer living in fear, became neighbors. They helped Silas rebuild his fences and dig a new, clean well. Ara's garden expanded, a symbol of the new life that was blooming all around them. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Silas and Ara stood on the ridge overlooking their land. Silas opened his hand. In his palm was the silver locket. He opened it, revealing the tiny portraits of Sarah and Lily. Then, with a gentle sadness, he closed it and hurled it as far as he could into the valley below. He was letting go of the ghosts. He turned to Ara, and for the first time, she saw no shadows in his eyes, only a clear, bright future. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "We saved each other," he said, and this time, it wasn't a lament for the past, but a promise for the future. The lonely rancher had found his redemption, and the orphan girl had finally found her home. They had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger. Two broken souls who, together, had become whole. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out, and it ensures you won't miss our next story. Thanks for listening.